if you do not want to be recorded, this is the time to switch off your camera. So good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon here in South Africa and in Europe. Good morning for those of you logging in from the Americas, so Mariana and others. And good evening to those of you from Australia and Asia. Jacinta, it's midnight or even later. There's some horrible time for the Australians. But it's wonderful to have you here. I'm Adrian van Breda. I'm one of the members of the INTRAC executive. I teach social work at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'll be chairing this stream on theories in care leaving research. So just to set up what this is about a little bit, four of us, myself, Samuel Keller, who you met earlier, Veronica Paulson and Inga Otterholm, we are co-editing a book with Policy Press called Living on the Edge, doing research on care leavers on the edge. And what we're trying to do in this book is to gather primarily members of CORIT. And CORIT, for those of you not familiar, community of researchers in transition, is for people who are busy with postgraduate studies or recently completed their postgrad studies. So what we might call emerging scholars. And so the authors of the book are primarily members of CORIT. And so what we're looking for is young scholars, not necessarily young in age, but young in their academic journey, to write about edgy issues in care leaving research, the kind of topics that some of the older scholars might not be focusing on. So to try and find fresh angles on care leaving research. And we have these three streams: groups of care leavers, methods of care leaving research, and theories informing care leaving. And these are the three streams that we have today. If you do get to the point during this session that you're like, I don't want to be this, I'm not really interested in theories, you can leave this group and join another group. We hope you don't, but you can if you want to. Like at a conference, you know, you can hop between venues to follow the topics. We have 4 chapters in the book on theory, but 2 of the participants are not able to be here today. One because of childcare arrangements and the ungodly hour it is in Australia right now, and the other because she's handing in her PhD dissertation this month and is furiously finalizing that. So those were both, we thought, really good excuses. As a result of that, I, who am not a member of CORIT, will also be presenting a paper so that we have 3 papers and not just 2 in the time that we have available to us. So we're going to do each paper one by one, and at the end of each paper, we'll have some time for conversation and discussion. You're welcome to chat your comments in the chat, and you're also welcome to speak them out loud. I'm going to suggest that once we start with the presentation that everybody switch off their camera except for the person who's doing their presentation. And then when we come into the discussion, feel free to put on your camera, either raise your hand, you should be able to see that in the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or just switch on your camera, because as soon as we see your face appear on screen, we'll know that you want to participate. So that's, I think that's the broad plan for today. Just for the speakers to let you know, I'm going first. Jacinta, you're going second. I'm not sure if Philip is presenting with you, but we'll see when we get there. And then Anna Christina, you're going third. All right, good. And you should all be co-hosts. Yes, I'm just checking. Yes, you are. So you can do your own screen share. So if you would just give me just a second. I have so many screens open on my document here. Let me just get a share screen up and running. There we go. Good. Can I just confirm with you, can you see my PowerPoint? Is it showing up full screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Great stuff. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory in care leaving research. And this is a piece of research that I'm currently busy with a colleague of mine, Sasam Naidu, who might actually be here with us today. Let's have a quick squiz. Yes, Sassam is here.
I am,
Hi,
yeah.
Sassam.
Hi.
So I'm working on this together with Sassam, who's one of my PhD students. So the focus of this paper is to think a little bit about the state of theory in care leaving research. And the reason I'm presenting this in the stream is because we think that it will lay quite a good foundation for the ongoing conversation that we'll have during the 90 minutes available to us. So Mike Steen, who's here with us today. Mike, we always salute your writing and your work. Thank you so much for providing such a wonderful heritage and legacy for all of us. But back in 2006, Mike wrote this article, Young People Aging Out of Care, the Poverty of Theory. And he lamented the lack of theory informing care leaving research in this article, and emphasized that a lot of the research that was being done, certainly at that time, was quite descriptive and empirical, presenting numbers and describing what was happening with young people, but not theorizing or conceptualizing it. So when I started working in this area around that time, that his article and that comment had a particular impact on me. And so I began working with an organization called Goals in Boys Town, South Africa, which provides residential care, on generating a theory of care leaving using grounded theory methods. And the graphic on your right is the product of that. The article itself is referenced at the bottom of the screen there. So if you want that, you should be able to access it in the Journal of Youth Studies. And I've continued to work on this with two of my students, Joyce Lungwani, who I don't think is here today. She did work on this for her master's and is now doing a PhD. And then Sassam Naidu is doing work on also advancing this theory. So we continue to work on it here in South Africa. And I'm not presenting this theory to you, just to kind of give you some context that the question of theory and how theory influences our understanding of care leaving is of interest to me. So what I'm presenting to you today is a study that's still in progress, and that's really nice because I'm hoping to get some good inputs from you that will help us shape the ongoing work that we do on this article. We're conducting a systematic review or perhaps a scoping review. You might advise us later on as to which one it would be. And the research question that we're asking is, what theories are used or are being generated to explain the transition out of care towards young adulthood? So what theories are used or are being generated to explain the transition out of care towards young adulthood? And we have three sub-questions or objectives, if you want, under that. What theories are used most frequently? How is theory used to guide research? And how does theory inform the practice implications of the research? I'm going to be focusing today just on the first two of those sub-questions and not the third one. So we did a search for literature published between 2015 and 2020, English language journals. They had to be peer-reviewed journals. We used a number of the well-known databases, EBSCOhost and so on. And we searched for the keywords leaving care and theory with an asterisk. So theory, theoretical, theorization, and so on, anywhere in the title keywords or abstract of the article. And from that, we produced this table, which will be familiar to those of you who've read systematic reviews using the Prisoner system. We identified 771 articles from this list of databases that's in the big box at the top. Of those, 229 were duplicates, so we excluded those, leaving 542. We excluded a further 332 of those. Mainly, as you can see there, 293 were not on leaving care. Quite often, if you search for leaving care, you pick up stuff about people in hospital and transitioning out of hospital care. And so most of the articles that we excluded at that stage were not focused on care leaving. That left us with 210. And then we looked closely at those ones and we excluded 41 of the articles based on the actual review of the article itself, because they did not have a theory focus. And so we were left with 169 articles for this review. some of the articles, some of those 169 articles used more than one theory. And so we actually had 196 theory codes, if you want. So some articles would come up 2 or 3 times because they used multiple theories. So these are the emerging themes that came in response to our second research question, which was, how is theory used to guide research? And working inductively, and I was looking at how these articles made use of theory without any preconceived ideas, we identified 3 main ways that care-leaving scholars seem to make use of theory in their publications. The first is what we've called theory-driven studies. And these are publications where theory is introduced, usually in the opening pages, possibly the introduction, or in the theory literature review section, or perhaps in the methodology, but it's introduced before the findings. And then the whole study is shaped by that theory, and usually to answer a theoretical question. So the theory informs the study, and the researchers are aiming not just to describe something, but really to answer a theoretically driven question. The second use of theory that we found was what we've called theory-informed studies. And these are studies where the theory comes into the article later, towards the end of the article, usually in the discussion or perhaps in the conclusion, but certainly after the findings. And theory is then used to illuminate or explain or to shed light on the findings. So we've called those theory-informed because the article is not driven by a theory, but rather theory is brought in after the fact to make sense of and to interpret findings. And then the third group, we've really struggled with the name of this. So if somebody has a suggestion for this, we'd be open. We're calling theory-alluded studies. In other words, these articles allude to theory rather than are driven or informed by theory. So in these articles, we found that there is some mention of theory or theoretical ideas or terms or concepts, but theory doesn't drive the study in the way that the theory-driven ones do, but also not really used to explain the findings. So there's sort of drops of theory scattered around the article, but not used in a particularly coherent, cohesive, focused way. Well, those are the 3 categories that we came up with. And I suppose one of the questions we might have is whether you think these is a useful typology for thinking about how theory is used in care-leaving research and perhaps in research more generally. So we did then a review of the 196 theory themes that we identified in the 169 papers, and we found that 50% of the papers were theory-driven, 19% were theory-informed, and 31% were theory-alluded. So half of the papers really focused on theory and were asking theoretical questions and attempting to answer those through the research. 1 in 5 brought theory in towards the end of the article to shed light on their findings, and almost a third mentioned theory here and there or theoretical concepts and ideas, but the study was not really sort of drenched in theory. So we should just remember that these articles that form part of our data set are articles that all had already made some reference to theory. I mean, that was part of the search criteria, was that they had to refer to theory to qualify in our study, and that there were many articles that were on care-leaving that didn't come into our data set, perhaps because they did not refer to theory, or perhaps just didn't use the word theory or theoretical in the article. But 20% of those that we reviewed were filtered out in the previous stage for not making use of theory. If you remember the prisma diagram, 20% of the articles were filtered out because even though they used the term theory, there was no theory evident in the article. So that's the first piece of findings that I want to share with you. The second piece is to answer the question, which theories are used most frequently? And what I've presented here is just a frequency distribution of the 7 most prominently used theories in our study. Together, these 7 theories account for 51% of the 196 theory codes used in the 169 studies from 2015 to 2020. And what you'll see here is that resilience theory emerges head and shoulder above any other theory. 25% of the articles that we reviewed made use of resilience theory. In case you think I'm biased because I am a resilience scholar, and so that's my preferred theoretical lens, we really look quite closely, and resilience really did emerge in these articles very prominently. The next highest were attachment theory and emerging adulthood with 8% each. Then we have life course theory, and there's in fact a life course group that is emerging in INTRAC to explore the use of life course theory. Robbie Gilligan, who's here, is a key member of that. Social capital emerged in 6% of the articles. The ecological theory or person and environment systems theory emerged in 3% and focal theory in 1%. And then the other theories that emerged, of which there were many, would have appeared then just in 1 or 2 articles. And so these were really quite fragmented. So these are the 7 most prominent theories that emerge. What's interesting about those 7 is that 3 of those are the theories that Mike Steen recommended could be useful for care leaving research in his 2006 article, and that was resilience, attachment, and focal theory. And so these certainly have risen over time to become key theories. Although focal theory still sort of languishes at the bottom of that list, we think that that could be a theory that's worth using more substantially. We've then broken each of those down into whether it was the theory used in the theory-driven or theory-informed or theory-alluded way. And what we see is that in most cases, most of the articles were using the theory in a theory-driven way, anything from 40% to 73%. And the one theory which was not much used as theory-driven was attachment theory, where you'll see most of those articles used it in a theory-alluded way. In other words, they touched on or mentioned attachment, but didn't actually talk about attachment theory in any sort of substantial way. So a few limitations of this study. The first is that the search terms may well have missed relevant publications. We used leaving care as the key phrase for picking up care leaving research, but we know that many articles use different language. And we also required the article to have the word theory or theoretical or theorize or something like that in the article. And sometimes people refer to theory, but don't call it theory. It might be an approach or a perspective. And so they use that word rather than theory. We would have missed those articles. We searched only for journal articles. We didn't look at books or chapters or grey literature. And it was tricky for us to define quite what the boundaries were around theory. When does something become theory and not just a concept? So we worked quite sort of generously in what we included in this definition. But those are some limitations. And so it's quite possible if we shared the list of articles with you that your article would not be there. And you'd be asking us, why is it not there? It was just not there because of the search criteria that we used. And then finally, just some implications for us to think a bit about going forward in terms of using theory in research. The first is that we may want to make greater efforts to ground research in theory. I presented this previously to Mark Courtney, and he made the observation that not all research has to be theory-driven or particularly theoretical. Research really can be empirical and descriptive, and I do fully agree with that. But we certainly may want to be doing more work on thinking about how we ground our research more deliberately and consciously, self-consciously almost, in theory. We may want to make use of a wider range of theories. So even just in the list I showed you, there were some theories like focal theory that is being used, but very rarely, and we may want to make greater use of that. We may also want to think about drawing on creative and edgy theories, particularly in the context of today's session where we are looking at edgy and on the edge theories. So perhaps there are theories out there that have not been used in this context, and could be brought in, and we could say, how is this theory relevant and useful in the area of care leaving? Thirdly, we think that we may want to reduce the theory-alluded studies and rather have more theory-informed or theory-driven studies. So roughly a third of the articles that we reviewed that referred in some way to theory did so in a very peripheral way. And theory was not central either in driving the study or in informing the understanding of findings. And we may want to reduce the percentage of articles in care leaving that mention theory only in passing. And finally, we think that there is still a need for theory construction, particularly within care leaving, that we draw on other theories, but we think that we should be constructing theory of care leaving. And once a tentative theory emerges, we think that we should then be helping each other by doing validation studies on those theories. In other words, test to see, does it work in our context or with a different population of care leavers? So that's my, my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. I see that there's lots of comments popping up in the chat. Unfortunately, couldn't read them while I was doing the presentation, but we can have a look at some of them now, and also just ask people or invite people to pose any questions. So we'll have a few minutes now. I just want to keep an eye on time and just make sure we don't go too far over. This is the challenge of presenting and sharing. 45, so we have an hour left. Good, so we've got about 10 minutes or so to field any comments or questions from anybody who'd like to go.
My question is in the chat. Oh.
I would like to ask a question, if it's possible.
Yes, Emmanuel.
My name is Emmanuel Gruper. I am from Israel. And my question is about grounded theory, because I didn't see in your presentation this kind of possibility. You refer to 7 kind of theories, but we know that in many researchers, we try to develop a grounded theory that comes out of it. So could you refer to this, please?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Emmanuel. So we regarded grounded theory per se as a methodology rather than as a theory. But if out of the grounded theory method, the authors produced a theory, such as the one that I presented on my first or second slide, where the grounded theory process generated a theory, then we would have included that theory. So the outcome or the result of the grounded theory method, we regard it as a theory. The challenge that seems to emerge here is that the rest of us don't pick up on that grounded theory and then replicate it in another study somewhere else. So those theories have not achieved traction. So the only person that would be writing on that theory typically is the person who generated it. And that might come up in 1 or 2 articles and not in others. So my theory would be an example of that. So we produced this theory 6 years ago, and the only people who've written on it are myself and my students. Nobody else has picked it up and said, let's see whether Adrian's theory works in another context. So that's what we've seen with that. Is that?
Thank you.
That answer, thank you. Gertrude, I think you were about to ask a question.
Yes, no, I was just saying I put my question in the chat.
Okay, do you want to just read it out for us? Sorry,
yeah, no, that's fine. So I was saying, my question is, how important is theory in care living studies, particularly in areas where the study of care living is quite new and perhaps there's not much evidence to construct theory from in those contexts? Perhaps the studies that you said did not have any theory were focused first on building an evidence base to draw from. I'm not sure, but I'll be happy to hear from others.
That's such a great question, Gertrude. So really, Gertrude is from Zimbabwe. Yes, and that very much describes our experience in South Africa. When we started doing care leaving research, the initial studies were primarily descriptive, trying to just describe how many people are there, what happens to them, do they work, do they slip into crime, and so quite descriptive, just building up a basic knowledge base, even just like how many are there and where did they go. And then over time, I think one can then, as in a sense one matures, if that doesn't sound too sort of paternalistic, as you build up a knowledge base, I think then one can start to ask these more critical questions, reflective, theoretically informed questions. So in South Africa, I feel like we've made that journey from the initial descriptive studies to more theoretical work. Although I think that we're still far behind some of the other countries in the world that have been doing this much longer. And so I think, as Mark Courtney said, there's no shame in doing studies that are just descriptive, particularly when you're doing the first or second study in a country or with a group of people.
That's comforting. Thank you.
Thanks, Gertrude. Carrie. Hi, Carrie.
Hi. Oh, sorry, my voice just went then. So yeah, I put something in the chat as well because I guess I'm coming from a children's geographies approach. So obviously emerging adulthood is a context of that. But actually care leavers is very, and transition even into adulthood is very kind of, it's still in its very early days within children's geographies really. There isn't a lot there, especially in terms of care leavers. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 articles using the approaches. And I don't know if it's because, obviously I'm care experienced myself, but I really felt like a desire to move away from resilience theory and some of those theories that put the I guess the onus onto the heads of the care leavers in terms of how they succeed and all of those different things. And I really wanted to explore the impact of the systems and the power dynamics and the agency within all of that. So I don't know, I didn't find anything really linked to this when I was doing my research. I don't know if I'm just being really naive and just missed something completely obvious, but I guess it's just kind of seeing how people would take that understanding, I guess.
Thanks, Carrie. I think that's also a really good critical question for all of us, I think, to reflect on. So just on resilience theory, I think that resilience theory does have a bad reputation for being individualizing and neoliberal in its approach. I hope if you would read some of my work that you would see that we try to avoid that and that adopting a more multi-systemic or ecological approach tries to look at the interaction between young people and the environments and the kinds of systemic enablers that are put around them and that are the responsibility of the state and society to provide. But I think you're right in recognizing that a lot of the theory that is used in quite individualizing ways, and that, as you say, put the responsibility, what we call responsibilization of young people, that they become responsible to figure out how to navigate without much support. So work on children's geographies, institutional ethnography, which Ingrid, I always have to look up her, I call her Ingrid Hanna Benwick from Norway. She's presenting in one of the other groups at the moment. She's using institutional ethnography that really does an ethnography, not of an individual, but of the actual institution that provides care to care leavers. And so she's trying to bridge together that micro and macro, the individual and the institutional. So I think that there are people working in that area, but coming from children's or geography's perspective, I think you would probably do that more effectively than most of the rest of us, because you have a different disciplinary lens on that, so different theoretical foundation. So look forward to seeing how that all goes. Yeah, all the best. I think we might have time just for one last question, then I'm keen to hand over to Jacinta. So Jacinta, if you can just get yourself geared up. Yes, Zulmir, hi, I see your hand, thank you.
Yes, it is. Thank you for a great presentation, Adrian. Great listening to you. My question is kind of related to my approach to the field of child and youth studies. I wonder, in your review, what's the status of theoretical status of concepts like citizenship, rights, participation, exclusion, inclusion, which kind of connects to what Kerry is talking about, I think, the more structural level of the path, transition path.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So I'm looking at our screen. Sorry, I've got 3 screens. So I'm just having a quick squiz through the list of our publications to see the theme. So social exclusion came up in one article. Human rights comes up sort of again, sort of once or twice, not very prominently. Occupational justice comes up in one. So when those concepts around social justice and rights and so on, when they come up infrequently. And so that, I think, is also an area that's, in my view, quite emerging. So Sue Bond in South Africa has written an article looking at 3 countries in terms of their social policies and how they approach, and she uses a social justice perspective there. Philip Mendes has also fairly recently, a year or 2 ago, written an article on social justice perspectives on care leaving. But my impression, maybe I've just missed the literature, is that there's very little literature adopting an approach that takes a clearly, strongly social justice, human rights, empowerment, inclusion, exclusion kind of perspective. And pulling those together in a coherent way and connecting them, I think would be an important route for us to go, particularly when we think about children's rights and young people's rights.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ormi. All right, colleagues, thank you so much for your engagement. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for listening and responding. I'm going to have a look at the comments a little bit later, but now I'd like to introduce Jacinta Waugh,